Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Claire Pride. Today we're focusing on Venezuela's political and economic crisis after the opposition Democratic Unity Coalition cleared the first hurdle towards holding a referendum on the leadership of President Nicolas Maduro. The National Electoral Council confirming that opposition petitions had been signed by 1% of voters in every state. But no date has been set for the next phase, which requires the collection of 20% of signatures. In a moment, I'll introduce you to our guests. But first, this report by Alexander Alcott.
Venezuela's National Election Council has validated the first stage towards a potential referendum to oust socialist President Nicolas Maduro. This after a nationwide petition backed by the opposition MUD coalition managed to gain the required number of signatures.
The 24 states fulfilled the requirement of 1% of validity of ballots, and the certification will be extended by the Secretariat.
Amid the backdrop of a failing economy, one of the world's highest inflation rates, and worsening food shortages, many believe the only way out of the economic nightmare is to cut Maduro's term short and hold new elections. The opposition has recently made significant advances, including taking control of the National Assembly last year, with Maduro's rival Ramos Alup at its head. But the government has vowed to block any referendum this year, launching close to 9,000 lawsuits and accusing the MUD of falsifying signatures.
The recall referendum is illegal because nothing can be built upon this base that is profoundly fraudulent. Unfortunately for opposition voters, their leaders have deceived them by not following the appropriate legal steps.
The next step in the process towards a referendum, while yet to be announced, would require the opposition gathering close to 4 million signatures, or 20% of the voting electorate, in just 3 days. They'll be up against the clock. The MUD have until the 10th of January next year for any meaningful recall vote to take place. If Maduro was to lose past this date, he would be replaced by his vice president, ensuring the Socialist Party stays in power, at least until the next presidential election, planned for 2018.
All right, it's time now to introduce my guests. Here with me in the studio, Vincent Yuliv Schnell, a Venezuelan writer. Hello, thank you very much indeed for joining us. You are the author of This, I Killed Simon Bolivar. Joining us from Washington, D.C., Mark Weiss-Brott, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Hello, and thank you very much for your time. I'm going to start off with you, Vincent. Venezuela's unemployment rate is one of the highest in the world, as is the inflation rate. Who is to blame? What is to blame for this situation in Venezuela? Is it socialist economic policies?
Yes. I think the economic policies that have been implemented in Venezuela, whether being socialistic or not, have been completely erroneous. What Venezuela has done has proven yet again that if you fix prices and you try to control the prices of products, this will cause scarcity and ramping inflation by printing money bills. So Venezuela, not by being socialist or not, but just by going against any economic sense that we know after 200 years of economic theory, has really put itself actually into this position where the inflation is the largest in the world, and we have rampant scarcity. It's very difficult to find food, and we're on the brink of a humanitarian crisis, unfortunately.
Turning to you, Mark, in Washington, do you agree with Vincent on the causes of this crisis?
Well, I agree with some of it. I'm actually a member of the UNASUR economic team, which has put forth a proposal. This is an independent team. It's headed by Leonel Fernandez, the former president of the Dominican Republic, and Ernesto Samper is, of course, head of the UNASUR, of UNASUR, and he is also a part of this, a former president of Colombia. And a number of economists are on the team, and I'm one of them. And we put forward a proposal to fix the Venezuelan economy, and of course, it includes adjusting some of the things that are really out of balance. And most importantly, of course, is the exchange rate. You have a a terrible imbalance there. We proposed unifying the exchange rate and, of course, and floating it. And some of the price controls also would have to be removed. But we also proposed to make sure that people didn't suffer from this transition. That is, that they would have something like the food stamp program we have in the United States, where they would get a discount on food and other necessities to ensure that the devaluation didn't hurt people. So it is possible to have recovery, but I think for all of these things, the dialogue is very important. And there's another part of the UNASUR team that's a political dialogue, and I think that's also very important. And there you have the former presidents of Spain, Panama, and again, Dominican Republic, Leonel Fernandez, Martin Torrijos from the former president of Panama.
But Mark, if I could just interrupt. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Just how open, though, is Venezuela's government to advice from the outside world?
Well, they've been very open to this. They've cooperated with this process. They've cooperated also with the dialogue. And I think, and by the way, I just have to correct
no,
one
they haven't.
statistic.
They have not collaborated with the dialogue.
From the beginning, I just want to correct one statistic from the beginning, that Venezuela does have one of the highest inflation rates in the world. And again, the proposal deals with that, but it doesn't have one of the highest unemployment rates at all. The unemployment rate is not much higher than it's been in recent years. But in any case, I think, yeah, the government, there is a dialogue, and I think the dialogue is very important. You have a polarized political situation. In the last election, the opposition, the government still got 41% of the vote. There's still a lot of people believe in Chavismo because they think the alternative is worse. And you have to remember also that this government, the Chavismo, did deliver a huge increase in living standards for 10 years. And so it's the last 3 years have been very bad, and so they've lost a lot of those gains. But you can understand why there still is a base, and a base that fears, for example, that if the opposition takes power, it will get worse.
Mark, I'd just like to give Vincent the opportunity to respond. What do you make of those comments? It can be said that there have been relatively few protests, wouldn't you say?
Relatively few protests? No. There are protests in Venezuela every day, very violent. We are really in a difficult position right now. But I'd just like to reiterate the fact that when Mr. Weisbrot talks about a dialogue and this disposition by the government, I'd really like to see how that plays with Mr. Diosdado Cabello, who's one of the head honchos of the Chavista government, calling for bloodshed basically in Maracaibo like the day before yesterday. Jorge Rodriguez, who you just saw on TV, saying that the recall referendum would never happen and it was the biggest heist and the biggest fraud in the history of Venezuela. His words. So I have a tough time seeing how, after jumping through all these hurdles and that the opposition manages to gather all these things that the Electoral Council has basically added in order to make the process more and more long. Now that we have everything, when we have these people talking about bloodshed and murder and civil war, and then Mr. Weisbrot tells me that, no, they're actually really open to dialogue, I have a difficult time seeing that.
And also, some people would say that the reason we might not be seeing all that many protests, or perhaps it's just that we're not hearing about them, is because people are busy queuing for basic supplies and they're afraid of some sort of violent response.
Yes, absolutely. But you do have ONGs, non-government organization, NGOs, that do cover the amount of protests in Venezuela, and they are exploding. We have dozens of protests every day that are sometimes very violently disrupted. So it's not a case that people are just taking this sitting down. No, people are very angry, and they are reacting in a very violent way because they don't have food, which is understandable.
Mark, would you say the government perhaps is in denial about the severity of this crisis?
Well, I think you have to ask them that. I mean, I'm not here to defend the government, and I won't defend inflammatory statements from either side. I mean, there were inflammatory statements from the opposition side. Even Capriles, who's one of the supposedly more moderate opposition leaders, has really called openly for regime change, and we know what that means. We've seen a lot of violent protests in Venezuela in 2014 and 2013 when they refused to recognize the presidential election results, even though there was absolutely no doubt about those results. And so I think that it's wrong to, people are here looking at it from the outside, And the United States government, for example, has been trying to overthrow this government, the Venezuelan government, for 15 years already. And you have the head of the OAS intervening and saying, that they have to invoke the democratic charter against Venezuela. I don't think any of that is productive at all. I think that really hurts. That just further polarizes the situation. And that's in general true when foreign powers intervene in that way and support extra legal change. So I think the dialogue process is important, but you don't see much about it. The media doesn't talk about it very much. They've pretty much ignored the economic proposals and almost completely. And why is that? I mean, that's the question I would ask. I mean, why isn't there more attention? The Vatican seems like it's willing to join the dialogue as well.
Mark, I'm sorry to interrupt. You say you're not defending the government, and yet you seem to agree with it on the causes of this crisis, because Venezuela's government says that it's to do with the drop in oil prices and that there's an economic war being waged by its opponents. You just said the U.S. has been trying to bring down the government for years. What do you base that on?
Okay. Now, I don't think you've been listening very carefully, because I didn't mention anything about, I didn't even mention oil prices, and I didn't mention any economic war.
But you said the U.S. has been trying to bring the government down.
Maybe you've been listening to the government and you are attributing those views to anybody who doesn't take the view of the United States government. I said, yes, that the United States government has been trying to, that's well documented, okay? So this isn't a question of what the Venezuelan government alleges, okay? There was a military coup in Venezuela in 2002, which the State Department of the United States admitted that they funded the people who were involved in the coup, and all the way through in the 2013, 2014 disturbances, the United States made public statements that questioned the legitimacy of the government and supported the violent protests. So there's a whole 15-year paper trail of this. Now, why do I mention this? I'm not saying that the troubles of the economy are a result of what the United States is doing. I'm saying that the United States has a program to get rid of this government, and that's obvious. And I say that influences the media coverage, as we can see even right here on this show.
Vincent, what's your response?
Well, I think that's just completely absurd. That's just the same kind of argument that they keep on rehashing year after year. The 2002 coup was 14 years ago, and now we have people that are hungry in Venezuela. We have political prisoners who have been recognized by NGOs and Amnesty International to be in jail for non-legitimate reasons. And
Human
these
Rights
people,
Watch says people have been tortured.
Exactly. And we have all this. This is well documented. I'm not making this up. You can look it up. And we have to sit here and listen to people talk about the 2002 coup and some harebrained explanation about how the United States wants to do away with Venezuela through means that we don't really know, when all the opposition wants is a recall referendum. They have the signatures for that, and they want amnesty for political prisoners. I think that they have a case to be had in that matter. And
but do you think it's going to happen? Do you think they're going to get to that second phase and, more importantly, have the referendum held this year so that Maduro is not just replaced by his vice president who would have the same policies?
Well, no, I think, obviously, I think the government is trying to drag its feet in this. And what we accomplished now, you have to understand that the government changed the rules on this same recall referendum various times. We had to have 1% of the whole signatures to activate the referendum. Then they changed it and they said it was 1% of each and every state. After doing that, they went through a thorough process in which they invalidated a bunch of signatures, including Mr. Capriles himself, who was the opponent of Nicolas Maduro. He could not sign against Mr. Nicolas Maduro. I know people in my family whose signature was invalidated. These cases were just very, very documented. After we did all this, now the only thing the opposition has is the right to ask in written consent for the activation of the referendum to the National Council. Then they take this and they have 15 days in which they can answer to consider if they're going to do this or not. After saying that, they have another 5 working days in which they can say when the referendum is going to be held. So we have to do this before the October 10th. If the referendum is not activated before October 10th, then Maduro stays. It would be a complete catastrophe. I don't think we will even have the date before the end of August. We're not going to know when this recall referendum is going to be held. So October 10th is a date that we're looking for, and it's a very short window. I don't think, following your question, that that's going to happen.
Mark, what do you think? Is the National Electoral Council biased? That's what the opposition alleges.
Well, I think it is. I'm not here to defend the government. I think you do have. I think there should be a referendum. Obviously, the Constitution provides for one, and the opposition wants it as soon as possible because they want to. Obviously, they want to get rid of the president, and if it's delayed until I think the 2nd or 3rd week of January. Then they will get the vice president, if they win, and so they wouldn't get a new government that they want, and so there's a conflict here. The Constitution provides for a referendum, but there is a complex set of rules that have to be followed. And there was a timeline put out by the Eurasia Group, for example, that showed that even if the government did everything perfectly, it would still be a referendum in December. You have to remember also the opposition, delayed. They could have started this process in January, and they waited several months until April because they were trying other means to get rid of the government. They couldn't agree on how to get rid of the government. Some wanted to just go to the streets and get rid of. Some wanted a constitutional amendment to shorten his term, which of course was never going to be possible. So there were mistakes, I think, on both sides here. And that's why I think dialogue is important, because this isn't something that can necessarily be resolved that easily. You have to have dialogue and negotiation. I think it's, the reason I mentioned the external intervention is because we're having this discussion as though some great crime is being committed here. Because the opposition is not getting the referendum as fast as they can. You have problems in a lot of countries. In the United States, we just found out that the Democratic National Committee conspired against Bernie Sanders.
Mark, we don't have people queuing for basic supplies in very many countries and having to cross the border to Colombia.
The situation is more serious, but I'm saying that we don't have calls for OAS intervention in Brazil, for example, where the president is being impeached under a process that is widely seen as illegitimate. So we have a problem here. I just want to put the problem in context. You have a dispute over an electoral procedure. Nobody's saying that the referendum is not constitutional. There's a procedure and a timeline, and there's a dispute over the timeline. And because of this, for some reason, this is considered a problem for the international community. I think this is a problem for Venezuelans to settle. And you have, parts of the international community that that have offered to mediate and facilitate dialogue, and they're credible. And they're credible with both sides. And that is how the process needs to be resolved. Not through force, not through violence, not through threats from international organizations like the OAS, which has a Secretary General which has demonstrated extreme hostility towards Venezuela and has been rebuked by the majority of countries in the OAS for doing so.
The OAS says, though, that the Venezuelan government isn't open to getting aid. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Mark. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Thanks for joining us from Washington. And Vincent, thank you very much for coming in to the studio. I'm sorry we ran out of time. Thank you for watching. Do stay tuned to France 24.